Most attempts to take an immature Christian and transform them into a mature Christian usually means separating them from their non-Christian past, bringing them into our fellowships, and then recreating them in our image. A process that can actually sabotage the church's mission and short-circuit the organic process of world change. The traditional paradigm for discipleship requires time, fellowship, and formal discipleship training, which is intended to, over time, prepare Christians to begin their active role in evangelism at some point. But that regimen usually lasts months, if not years, and the believers who we confidently then call mature have not only lost their best chance to engage transformational relationships, which would have been right after their conversion, but more often than not, they also find themselves socially disconnected from the group they would have most likely reached. Now watch as I describe a series of conversations that could take place in your church. Let's just say that the church, a particular church, has a pastor named Bob, all right, Pastor Bob. So Pastor Bob, he preaches this great sermon, and a guy comes forward at the end of the sermon, a guy named Joe, and he says, "Hey, Pastor Bob, my name's Joe. Just want you to know that I appreciated your message today, and when you led us in that prayer at the end of the message, I prayed to receive Christ into my heart. Just want to let you know that." And Pastor Bob says, "Joe, that's great. That's amazing. Congratulations, that's the best news I've heard today." And Joe says, "Well, Pastor Bob, what do I do now? Now that I'm a Christian, what do I do?" Pastor Bob says, "Well, Joe, what you got to do is now you got to become a mature Christian." Joe says, "Well, Pastor Bob, what does that mean?" Pastor Bob says, "Joe, that means you go to a discipleship class." "Well, what's a discipleship class?" "Well, it means once a week, comes together once a week, every week for 6 months, and you learn about being a Christian." Joe says, "Pastor Bob, that's great. I'll go to the class." Goes to the class for 6 months, every single week for 6 months. 6 months later, comes down that same aisle at the end of the service, says, "Hey, Pastor Bob, just want you to know I finished the discipleship class." "Well, that's great, Joe. That's great news. Best news I've heard today." "Well, Pastor Bob, am I a mature Christian now?" Pastor Bob says, "Well, Joe, not quite. You're not quite mature." "Well, Pastor Bob, what do I need to do to become mature?" "Well, what you need to do to become mature is now you need to go to the advanced discipleship class." "Oh man, the advanced discipleship class, what's that look like?" "Well, now you get to come twice a week for a whole year." "Wow, that's a commitment, but I want to be mature, so I'll go to the class." Joe goes to the class for the next year, comes down at the end of one of the services a year later, and he says, "Hey, Pastor Bob, just want to let you know I finished the advanced discipleship class." "That's great. That's the best news I've heard today, Joe." Joe says, "Well, Pastor Bob, am I mature yet?" Pastor Bob says, "Well, not quite yet. Not quite yet. What do I have to do now?" "Well, now you have to go to the super advanced discipleship class." "Oh man, what does that mean?" "Well, you still have to go twice a week, but now you have to go for 2 years." 2 years? That's gonna be like that's gonna be like 3.5 years. "Well, you want to be mature, don't you?" "Okay, I'll go to the class." 2 years later, he comes down, says, "Hey, Pastor Bob, I finished the super advanced discipleship class. Am I mature now?" "Congratulations, Joe. Now you're a mature Christian." "Well, Pastor Bob, now that I'm a mature Christian, what do I do?" "Well, what you do, Joe, is now you go back to your friends and your family, to your oikos, and you tell them about Jesus." Well, Joe has a problem, because his oikos has moved on. And we've given him a new oikos. Now, Joe's oikos is made up primarily of people like us. Well, forget Pastor Bob for a minute. Let's just say the Pastor Bob is not the pastor of that church, but the pastor of that church is a guy you've heard of. Significant upgrade from Pastor Bob. It's Pastor Jesus. Pastor Jesus gives an amazing message, which they all were. And at the end of that first message, Joe comes down and says, "Hey, Pastor Jesus, I want to thank you for your message today. And when you went through that prayer at the end of your message today, I prayed to receive you into my heart." And Jesus says, "Joe, that's the best news I've ever heard." And Joe says, "Well, Pastor Jesus, what do I do now?" What would Pastor Jesus say? I want you to go home to your own people and tell them what the Lord has done for you and how he's had mercy on you. And so Joe does that, goes to his oikos, meets with his homies, says, hey, fellas, just want to let you know something. I'm a Christian now. Gave my heart to Christ. Just putting it out there. Fellas say, well, Joe, what does that mean? Joe says, actually, I have no idea. But I'm going to go to a discipleship class this week, and that's the first question I'm going to ask the pastor. Hey, Pastor Jesus, I was talking to the fellas this week, and they wondered what it meant to be a Christian. And she said, well, Joe, what that means is that which is born of the flesh is flesh, but that which is born of the Spirit is spirit, and now you've been born again by the Spirit of God. Well, thanks, Pastor Jesus. Goes back to his fellas. Say, hey, fellas, I figured out what it means to be a Christian. Yeah, what's it mean? It means that I've been born of the Spirit of God. Well, what does that mean? I'm not sure, but I'm going to go back to a discipleship class this week and find out. Now, I'm not saying you'll have to change the regimen you presently follow to help people grow, to remain connected to the vine. But you might want to redefine the end game, readdress the purpose for those efforts, to bear fruit, which is the eternal salvation of the lost. And when churches provide their people two programs, a discipleship program and an evangelism program, neither thrives. The former lacks a compelling purpose, and the latter lacks an organic process. And our Heavenly Father, evidently, intends to prune those of us who forget that.